Good morning, everyone. You are, as I've mentioned multiple times this hour so far, tuned into 100.9 FM WXIR in Rochester. We're a little behind the gun jumping on the mics here because this is our first time back live in WXIR's studios for Evidence of Design. It is Saturday, June 20th. That is our present. Maybe it is yours too in 2020. Thanks for tuning in to our show and your local grassroots community radio station. That is WXIR. For those new to our show, we talk all about income and wealth inequality. We critique inequality, we investigate where it comes from, and we critique its effects. We think that economic inequality should be more foregrounded in our public debate and in our public scrutiny because its effects are widespread, negative, and harmful in so many aspects of our society. We think that economic inequality, primarily over the last 40 years, which has caused us to experience such widespread inequality, we think that inequality primarily comes from a push politically over the past several decades for an unfettered free market and a small government. We think there should be more public interests, not private interests. We are also going to try to put our co-host, Matt Treadwell, on the phone here. We're using multiple forms of technology this hour as we get ourselves arranged here. Matt, can we hear you yet?
Hello.
Yes, you are on the air. Matt, thanks for joining us via phone.
What a treasure. And
Mary Lawrence is also in the studio. Mary, do you want to give a quick shout here?
Oh, sure. Good morning, everyone. I'm just figuring out the soundboard.
So it's been a while. If you've been around through COVID, we've been pre-recording our shows, as you know, everyone else has been at the station, and we're given a live shot ourselves. We have our masks on, and we're all suited up, and we're still socially distant because Matt is calling in. So let's give it a shot. On today's show, we'll be covering a few things, first of which is Matt is going to give us a rundown of the election season. So many folks probably know that the primary election and local, well, basically, let me back up. The primary election is next Tuesday, June 23rd. There's been a lot in the news about that, of course, because COVID has impacted the kind of the timelines for that, and also there's been absentee voting, there's been early voting, so on and so forth. So Matt is going to give us a rundown of the elections that are right around the corner. You may have already voted already if you've done early or absentee voting. And later on in the show, after Matt's update, we're going to talk about 3 different things that have been in the news related to economic inequality. These have been perhaps not covered as much, rightfully so, because COVID continues to spread and also because of the valuable and important Black Lives Matter protests that are going on against police brutality and in favor, of course, of racial justice. So we'll be covering 3 different lenses on economic inequality, first of which are reports about police fees and fines and how more police departments around the country are reliant on fees and fines to cover their budgets, thanks to governments turning to tax cuts that have primarily favored the wealthy. Second of which, we'll be talking about work out of Harvard that has been analyzing various indicators related to COVID, and they found that the wealthy are not spending as much money as they used to, whereas those who are low income or poor are spending the same amount as they are now as they were before COVID. For those who know how our economy runs, around 70% of our economy is based off of consumer spending. So it's very important, if this is something you care about, in terms of how our economy works, for people to be spending money. Of course, our economy could be structured in different ways, but in terms of its current manifestation, consumer spending is very important. And we see that the wealthy are not spending a lot of money right now, not because they don't have the money to spend. They have tons of discretionary income, but there's nothing to spend their money on, at least not as much. And that's having very interesting effects on the economy. We'll talk a lot about that. And also we'll talk about reports where, normally graduating during a recession, as we are in one right now, normally graduating during a recession can lead to lifelong negative economic implications for you. But there are reports now that actually if you're graduating from high school during a recession and you go off to college, you might actually get ahead of your peers more than you normally would for going to college because other folks may not be. However, it's harmful in the United States because our colleges tend to be so expensive and exclusive that these kind of runaway benefits for graduating high school, going to college during a recession, are more and more landing themselves on the wealthy, which tend to exacerbate our inequalities. This isn't something that you see as much in Europe, for example, according to the reporting, because their colleges tend to be far more free and accessible. So it's, those three stories there we'll delve into, but again, these are different angles to capture the inequality lens and why we think it's so important to study it and affect it, because it has profound implications for our society when we are increasing economic inequality and providing power and leverage for a smaller and smaller amount of people who may not have democratic interests at heart. So, Matt, we're going to turn it over to you now on 100.9 FM WXIR and give you an opportunity to let us know what's going on with elections. There's, again, as I mentioned, a lot of different dates, timelines, and who the heck is running and all that. So do you want to kick it off and let us know what's going on with the context of voting right now?
Oh, if you're going to twist my arm. So followers of recent history, you might remember that New York's presidential primary was originally canceled back in April. The United States District Court Judge Annalisa Torres ordered the New York State Board of Elections to reinstate New York's Democratic presidential primary for June 23rd. This decision was later affirmed by the Second Court of the U.S. Court of Appeals. Some people may also be wondering, with Joe Biden being our presumptive Democratic presidential party nominee and all other runners in the race having either suspended or ended their campaigns, what is even the point in voting in the Democratic presidential primary? And the only answer I can really give you is that Bernie Sanders' campaign and Bernie Sanders' campaign has said that while his campaign is suspended, he plans to remain on the ballot in a number of states in order to further influence the convention, if it is indeed held, by obtaining as many delegates as possible. And I can assume that, the other candidates who are on the ballot feel the same way. Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden are not the only presidential candidates on the Democratic primary ballot, and the other candidates are Michael Bennet, Michael Bloomberg, Pete Buttigieg, Tulsi Gabbard, Amy Klobuchar, Deval Patrick, Tom Steyer, Elizabeth Warren, and Andrew Yang.
Matt, I'm not going to go. I'm going to interrupt you real quick and just say this feels like ancient history right now. Do you remember how quaint it was back in the day when we were talking about the Democratic presidential primary and all the names you read off of before COVID, before the killing of George Floyd? Oh God, this feels like ancient history.
I feel like I'm looking at a Facebook memories post, which is not something that Jason will probably understand. But
I get that though.
So yeah, if you are feeling so inclined, the primary is scheduled for this Tuesday, June 23rd. It's only open to voters registered with the Democratic Party, as that is the way in which New York State's primary process operates. There is also a special election for New York State's 27th Congressional District. The winning candidate will serve out the remainder of former Representative Chris Collins' term, who longtime listeners might remember, resigned from office in 2019 after pleading guilty to insider trading and other crimes. His term was set to end this year on December 31st. The winner will fill out the remainder of that term. There are a number of other offices holding elections at the state and local level. For instance, Robin Wilt is running against Joe Morelli again this year for the 25th Congressional District. You can find a full list of candidates by visiting the Board of Elections webpage at monroecounty.gov. While we have passed the deadline to apply for an absentee ballot by mail, that was this past Tuesday, the deadline for a postmarked absentee ballot to be returned has been extended to the day of the primary, June 23rd. So if you already have an absentee ballot but have yet to mail it in, there's still time for you to send it in and be counted. In addition, I should mention that even if you received an absentee ballot in the mail, the County Board of Elections made it clear that this does not prevent you from going to a polling place and voting in person. And in addition, if you are interested in an absentee ballot but have missed the deadline to apply by mail, you can still go to the Monterey County Board of Elections and apply for one in person. They are located on 39 West Main Street in Rochester, New York. The building is only open from 9 a.m. to 12 p.m. on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays due to the coronavirus, which means that your last opportunity to get an absentee ballot is this Monday. I should say that early voting is still being held until 3 p.m. today, and from 9 a.m. to 2 p.m. on Sunday, June 21st, tomorrow. Residents are able to participate in early voting at any of the designated early voting sites in Monroe County, and there are a number of them. They include the Irondequoit Public Library on Titus Ave and the Arnett Branch Library on Arnett Boulevard in Rochester. If you would like to see a full list of early voting sites, you can visit the Board of Elections webpage at monroecounty.gov. I think that's all I have.
Yes, this has been a really interesting election season and cycle, and it's kind of like for those who are in high school right now and Regents exams are canceled and so on and so forth, it's kind of like it's been phrased as a Hail Mary pass for those who might have had a tough time passing a Regents. It's kind of like a little bit of a freebie, not totally, but it's a Hail Mary pass. This is also... I want to be careful with my wording here. It's generous in terms of the amount of opportunities we have to vote, but it shouldn't be generous. So I think this should all be normal in normal circumstances, but, there is early voting, there's been absentee voting, and also there's still in-person voting, and you've read off all those kind of details, Matt, and you've also recited, if anyone needs this actual specific information, to check out our local Board of Elections' webpage on monroecounty.gov. Because there is as you mentioned, Matt, the Democratic presidential primary that was slated to be thrown out, but thankfully a Court of Appeals upturned that, in my opinion. And also there are local and state races going on as well. So a very important time. We're, of course, in a very important election year, and especially with all of the organizing and activism going on, right, there's a lot of ways to affect civil change, and organizing and activism is so important, and the one that I think in America we have a really tough time doing, and I'm personally heartened to see all of that going on too. And I would also say voting is still important. It's still very important to go out there and vote and make your voice heard, and if you don't like any of the candidates, then go write someone in. Are they going to win? I don't know, but you can still go vote and do it, and so I think it's pretty important.
It'd be very interesting to see a write-in candidate win.
Yeah, well, maybe with all the activism going on, we can all, someone can set that up. I'm not sure what the procedures are around that, but that is important. So I guess the last time to vote, Matt, for this primary election would be Tuesday, June 23rd, right?
That's right.
All right, that's important stuff. And last year, I think you've already mentioned this, but last year was the first election in New York State to allow early voting.
Yeah, which kind of blows the mind, I think.
Right. Cuomo lauds New York State as kind of the progressive capital of the nation, but many folks have done good work around how restricted it is to vote, particularly in New York State. And we've covered the New York State budget a little bit on this program in the past, and the budget recently instituted changes that made it harder for third parties in New York State to get on the ballot. A lot of people, critics of this change saw it as an attempt to undermine the Working Families Party, which, for those who remember, in Cuomo's last election for governor, he was running against Cynthia Nixon, and so now, because of changes in New York State, it's even harder for third parties to get on the ballot, and there's other reasons for that, but that's kind of what critics would argue. So yeah, we have an interesting kind of record of voting rights, and also we've covered on the show before how the Voting Rights Act has essentially been gutted by the Supreme Court, around a little after 2010, and we're still kind of living through that legacy where southern states in particular are able to restrict voting rights so much more. And we saw that in Georgia with Brian Kemp, I think he is.
Gubernatorial elections.
Yeah, Brian Kemp versus Stacey Abrams, thank you. Yeah, so voting is still really important, and unfortunately there's still a lot of people out there who want to take that right away from us. Of course, right now a huge controversy that Trump is creating is he's infamously against mail-in voting. He's arguing that mail-in voting will create a fraudulent election cycle, and he's just against it writ large for the general election. Mainly because, and he's come out and said this, and political science evidence supports this, is that the less people who vote, the more likely it is for Republicans to win elections. It's literally like a math formula. Like, the more suffrage you have, the more Democrats win. And so the goal of the Republican Party, one could argue, is to decrease suffrage so that it benefits their political chances. That's a kind of just political science fact there, and not my angle. But there's very good reporting out there right now that says we should be very wary about the November general election, because we're entering into that. I know it's hard to imagine because of everything else that is going on, but we have to be very wary of how the November general election happens. And make sure that we can get our voices heard through the voting process. And anything that we can do to increase voting, I think, is a good thing. Would it not be?
Yeah, as you said, Jason, there has been a real systemic and systematic effort to disenfranchise people in this country involving their right to vote, especially Black people. So we need to be ever vigilant and critical of whenever that right is being restricted.
Absolutely. And, it always does require us to do our homework to figure out all these different ways to vote and the things you've mentioned. And obviously COVID is a very real threat to potentially be a barrier to prevent people from voting, wary about catching COVID. And that's, I think, really fair and, a real concern. But I hope that whatever we can do, we can, get people to go out and vote for whomever. I would love to not have a political situation where one party wins because less people vote. So I would love everyone to go up there and vote for whomever they like and let the cards fall where they may, and not have the situation set up where we're incentivized to enfranchise some at the expense of others. And unfortunately, our country has a rich history of that. So I'm encouraged by any effort we can make to transcend that. And that starts kind of here with our conversation now. I'm just saying, hey, reminder, go out and vote. But let's turn our attention now to perhaps some other economic indicators that we mentioned at the top of the hour that have been in the news this week that shines a light, gets a little x-ray about how economic inequality continues to spread and how it continues to have negative effects on our society, and it manifests in so many subtle ways that we may not think about. So we'll be right back on 100.9 FM WXIR as a short break as we continue to talk about different economic indicators. I should also mention that because we are live on Saturday, June 20th, 2020, first time being live since COVID-19 started to shut everything down, we are able to take your phone calls at 585-219-8889. Again, that's 585-219-8889. You are always welcome to make your voice heard on your local grassroots community radio station, 100.9 FM, WXIR. We'll be right back. And you're back to 100.9 FM WXIR in Rochester, and you're tuned in to Evidence of Design. Our co-host Matt Treadwell just gave an update on voting in New York State, early voting, absentee voting, and also the Democratic presidential primary and state and local races being held next Tuesday, June 23rd. And now we'll turn our attention to several stories that were in the news this week, kind of buried under COVID, and also the continued Black Lives Matter protests, about various economic indicators that point to continuing increasing economic inequality and also the negative effects of that phenomenon. I'll first turn our attention to something that's come out of Harvard, and I I sort of joke around this because Harvard's Department of Economics is not known for being the most progressive thing out there. A lot of college economics departments, indeed the economics field in general, has been, I think, criticized by a lot of folks who would consider themselves to be advocates of progressivism, however you want. I don't mean to use that term pejoratively. I mean like people who want the economy to run the best way for the most amount of people with the least amount of barriers. These economics departments have not been known for their progressivism for a while because they're kind of so entrenched in free market ideology. Anyways, there is, however, a nonprofit and kind of a branch of Harvard's economics department called Opportunity Insights, and they basically capture big data and analyze it and see what trends and themes can come out of it. And so Harvard's Opportunity Insights has recently come out with a data set related to COVID-19, and there are various indicators on that data set, such as consumer spending, unemployment claims, and rates of COVID-19 testing. And what's nice about this new data set is that you can kind of play around the data, look at indicators county by county, state by state, and even for the nation as a whole. And one of the surprising findings from this new COVID-19 data set from Harvard's Opportunity Insights is that it received a little bit of media attention this week, and that's that according to the researchers, low-income households right now, those being classified as like the bottom 20% of poorest households in America, those low-income households are spending about the same now as they were before COVID-19. However, high-income households, those, again, around the top 25% of income-earning households in the United States, they are still spending considerably less now than they were before the pandemic. Nationwide, the poorest quarter of these American households are spending around 4% less than they were before COVID, whereas the wealthiest quarter of American households are spending close to 20% less now than they were before COVID. And because wealthier households control a greater share of income and have more income overall to spend, right? They kind of control a bigger piece of the overall pie. Whether they are spending or not has a lot of inertia and weight behind it that can really influence the trajectory of the economy. And the Harvard researchers found out that the wealthiest quarter of American households account for 2/3 of the overall total decline in spending since January.
So, Jason, I read this article a few hours ago, right before I went to bed. And what I was able to glean from it is that part of the reason why lower-income households are still spending about the same amount of money is because many lower-income households only have enough money to spend on essential items such as food, drug prescriptions, clothing, etc. So they don't really have the discretionary income, as it were, to spend on luxuries or other sort of unnecessary items or services.
Yeah.
What about the wealthier households?
Right. That's exactly right, Matt. There's kind of like an intuitive thing to understand here where it's like, if there are less wealthy households, they don't have a lot of discretionary income to begin with, and so they don't have the opportunity, they don't have the privilege to not spend their income because it's all going to necessities, right? It's going to housing, it's going to food, and it's going to transportation. And so to not spend money is to become destitute and lacking the bottom part of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is just sort of surviving in the world. And so there is that aspect. But also, spending for all groups did overall decline during COVID, and it continues to be a little bit depressed. But in terms of your question to wealthier households, what is interesting about why wealthier households are not spending as much now as they were before COVID, and again, COVID is still here with us, and it will likely still continue to be with us for quite some time. It's not magically gone now that we can walk into a restaurant. These wealthier households, by definition, have a lot of discretionary income. That's, again, what makes them wealthy. And so they're not spending because they don't have anything to spend. Rather, they're not spending because they don't have the same amount of things to spend their money on. So these wealthier households might normally be spending money on restaurants and dining, on lodging, on travel and entertainment and recreation, let's say. All of those sectors have been hardest hit by COVID. So, to make a general comparison here, poorer households are still spending money on basic goods, where our wealthier households are not spending as much on services.
If this spending gap is playing out differently amongst our economic classes and across various industries, is it also playing out geographically?
Yeah, so it is playing out among different economic classes. Again, we're talking about lower income groups and wealthier income groups. It's playing out differently across services. We know that the grocery services have been doing very well during COVID, and in fact, spending on groceries has actually increased during COVID. But these other industries like travel, lodging, entertainment in particular, and recreation have been very far down. But what's interesting about the research from Harvard's Opportunity Insights in this COVID data set they created is that the inequalities are playing out differently geographically. So let me first back up and reiterate that we are still kind of living through COVID-19, and we're at a very confusing point with COVID. Some 20 or so states have increasing cases. Some 20 or so states have decreasing cases. That includes us here in New York. And some 10 or so states have basically cases that have flatlined. Some states have reopened earlier than others, and some states are more densely populated. And above all of this, there's a federal government that has had a very, I would argue, poor, muted, and non-transparent and leadership-like response to this pandemic. And so we're kind of in this weird spot right now where there's 50 different battles being fought in 50 different states. And it's really hard to add up to be what am I as an individual in my life here in Rochester, New York, doing? How susceptible am I to catching COVID, so on and so forth. It's rather confusing, and there's very kind of nuanced and challenging national moment to figure out what's going on with COVID-19's geography. Well, speaking of the economic geography that you're asking about, Matt, the researchers suggest that, interestingly, wealthier neighborhoods with wealthier service-providing industries, again, those are the industries that are really hardest hit by COVID-19 right now because, in particular, wealthier households are not able to spend money on those things. These wealthier neighborhoods or wealthier service-providing industries have been hardest hit by COVID, and therefore will likely take the longest time to recover, and also might have to lay off most of their employees. And now it's worth pointing out from this point that the researchers do not quickly jump to say that we need the government to bail out these wealthier, neighborhoods and wealthier service-providing industries. What they do suggest about this phenomenon is that it's very worrisome for those low-income folks who work in these wealthier neighborhoods or for these wealthier service-providing industries, because these industries will likely take the longest to recover, and therefore these more low-income folks might have the hardest time coming back into the job market or gaining any income back to meet their basic needs or having any discretionary income. And we know, we covered last week that the Federal Reserve Chairman, Jerome Powell, recently said that our economic recovery from COVID-19 might take years, and that we could end this year at 9% unemployment. And so we'll have to see kind of how all this plays out, of course, because the virus is still very much out there. And as Dr. Fauci has said, the virus sets the timeline and the rules. We can influence the trajectory, but the virus is still its own kind of actor. What we should know now, though, what we should expect is that recovery from COVID will be very differently based on geography, and we'll have to see how it kind of plays out.
Yeah, I think one of the things that the article sort of went into, and that I know that you and I have talked about both in our private lives and on the show before, is just sort of the ability of wealthier people to prioritize their health during this crisis. A lot of wealthier families, for one thing, often work jobs that allow them to work from home. In addition, they often have access to money and wealth that will allow them to perhaps take an extended stay away from work if they need to, in order to prevent both themselves catching the virus and spreading the contagion. And I don't mean to criticize people's ability to slow the spread of the pandemic, but I think it's important to highlight that many poorer families are not able to make that choice. They are sort of held captive by the fact that they don't make enough money to not afford. They are not able to afford to not go to work. They're not able to afford to miss going to work, and many of them work jobs that they are not able to work from home. So they're constantly in the situation where they have to put themselves and their health and the health of their families at risk in order to survive, which is a horrible situation to be in, and one that we as a nation and a country, I think, need to do a better job of alleviating and fixing. But what do the researchers say that we should be doing?
Yeah, that's a great point, Matt. And I'd like to expand on that and remind folks that they're tuned in to 100.9 FM WXIR, and you're listening to Evidence of Design, and we're talking about research out of Harvard's nonprofit, nonpartisan Opportunity Insights team that came out with a COVID-19 data tracking set recently that has some interesting findings, namely that lower income households are spending about the same now as they were before COVID-19, but wealthier income households are spending around 20% less now than they were before COVID-19. Not because they don't have anything to spend, not because they've been hit hard by the pandemic. What you're getting at with your point, Matt, is you're right that, wealthier households have, in fact, kind of been able to weather the storm a lot better because they can go to second homes. They are more likely to have jobs that allow them to work from home. They are perhaps not as we've come to call, essential workers who are required to kind of show up for their day-to-day job that is typically low paid, that typically has poor benefits. And they might, these people might have to take public transportation to their jobs and be exposed to a lot of people. And so there's this whole kind of this pot of soup that we're getting into here. And I want to get back to this point in a second, but to answer your specific question in terms of what these researchers at Opportunity Insights suggest that we can do to kind of fix this differentiating spending issue between the wealthy and the poor classes is one, the obvious one is we need to find a solution to COVID-19. A vaccine would obviously do a lot because, again, we're living through kind of like a artificial recession right now. A lot of folks at the start of all of this, as our economy started to tank and we had we blew out the records for unemployment claims, a lot of folks thought that, well, if we just open back up our country and we stop these kind of heavy-handed government responses that are making us all social distance, then our economy will bounce right back. But we're seeing evidence right now that suggests that the recovery will take a lot longer, and that for those countries or for those states, that have quickly opened up, their economy hasn't necessarily magically bounced back, and so we're kind of looking at a much longer trajectory here. And so, if we can't find a vaccine for COVID-19, then we at least have to kind of adapt to it and learn how to live our lives differently, such that we can kind of go about our day-to-day without needlessly exposing ourselves to the virus or spreading it to others. And this will be with us for quite some time, I think, and we'll have to kind of live with that. But the other solution that I want to more highlight that these researchers suggest is that the government could and should continue to support low-income individuals at this time. So they could extend the unemployment claims that have been put out. Those, I think, expire in July next month. So they could extend those unemployment claims, and they could also perhaps consider doing another round of stimulus checks for these individuals. Again, when the federal government passed the $2.2 trillion CARES Act, included in that was those stimulus checks that went out to individuals who essentially made $100,000 or less. The numbers aren't exact on that, but these researchers suggest that the government could consider doing another round of stimulus checks for individuals who have been hit hardest or for the lowest income Americans. And this is all important. Like, why are we talking about why it's important for people to spend money? Because again, the way our economy is constructed, where 70% of our economy is run on consumer spending, if one person's expenses are another person's income. And I'm not saying this is the best way to run an economy. I'm not endorsing this platform. I'm just saying if we want sort of our economy, for what it's worth, to become healthy again, and we can all kind of have jobs and reliable income and all that, then we kind of need people to spend money. And the point I would go to here is that I want to critique the notion that there are people in this society who have so much money they don't know what to spend it on. And that's kind of what I'm getting to, where, of course, we have most of Americans who are living paycheck to paycheck and don't have discretionary income or the luxury to not spend money on travel, lodging, recreation, entertainment, going out to eat. And then we have these other individuals who simply, have too much money. And that literally has effects on the economy. I'm not just making a moral argument here. The way our economy is structured is that if corporations, hiding their savings offshore, evading taxes, this money that does not get put back into circulation to, let's use the conservative argument of trickling down to low-income individuals, if this money is not in circulation, then it's not going to people who need it. And it's not doing anything. And so that's an issue that I'd like to kind of highlight here.
Absolutely.
But Matt, I want to get back to that point. Maybe this is a messy point. This just came to me as you were talking about the idea that, like, oh boy, well, we're bringing up obvious points right now, right? Like, oh, wealthy people have more discretionary income. Sure, they're not spending as much money because, of course, you can't really go out right now and travel and go to fancy hotels and spend money on entertainment and recreation. Like, obviously, we get that, right? Well, the interesting thing, I'm just wondering about the comparison to the Black Lives Matter protests and calls for police reform and racial justice, is like, I would imagine a heck of a lot of people would say the same thing about those issues. Like, wait a second, they've been here for a long time. They've obviously been here. And why do we have to talk about it? Because they already are here, and we should have just already changed it or something. And I guess, as awful as it is, it's not just George Floyd who was killed to start all these protests, Breonna Taylor, et cetera. There's the whole movement and microcosm of all of this. But that cell phone video of George Floyd was so kind of so effectively captures the brutality of the system that it sort of becomes unarguable, or you can't avert your eyes to what has always been there. Just people aren't taking action on it. I would argue, not to detract from like the racial argument, that's not my effort here or intention, but I would argue like similar phenomena exists in our economics, and that we are sort of okay with people living in near destitution in the United States. We are okay with people living paycheck to paycheck, and it's sort of really sad that so many people, those are in position of power, have sort of been okay with racism and prejudice for so long, and people have been okay with economic destitution for so long. And I'm just really heartened right now to see the movements going on to fight for racial justice and call for systems to reform, like policing, that arguably deserve it. And I wonder similarly, like, how easy it might be, or how difficult it might be for similar movements to call out economic injustices too. And of course they've happened, and there are people calling them out right now. And it's just interesting to me, like how we live day to day with such brutalities, and suddenly they sort of become so manifestly intolerable for at least folks who see, I think, perhaps the right side of things.
That's a really good point, Jason. And I think this pandemic, this crisis, has really forced a lot of us to re-examine how many of our basic assumptions about how life is conducted in America work in practice. And it's not really deniable anymore that there are people who are being left behind, who are being severely impacted by this virus, and they're not getting the help that they need. We know that the coronavirus has impacted Black and brown communities, poor communities, much more drastically than in more affluent and more white neighborhoods. And that is something that we all need to acknowledge and wrestle with and make more of an effort to change. If we're going to call essential workers heroes, we need to start treating them like that. And by that I mean we need to be giving them access to protections that allow them to do their jobs more safely. But also we need to be just paying them better so that they are able to weather this crisis along with the rest of us.
Yeah, this is a great way, I think, to end this segment, and just say for those who want to learn more about what we've been talking about in this research from Harvard's Opportunity Insights team and play around with the new COVID-19 data sets, and you can even look at county by county. So Monroe County, for instance, apparently in April, according to this data set, our spending decreased by 50% here, and right now it's decreased by 14% compared to our spending in January. So interesting stuff, and especially, Matt, I think what we could leave with perhaps is our larger thoughts that you just mentioned. And so you can check out their data at tracktherecovery.org. Again, that's tracktherecovery.org. For now, I should remind you, though, that if you're just joining us, that you're tuned into 100.9 FM WXIR in Rochester, and you're listening to Evidence of Design. I want to turn our attention now to one other story in the news this week and elsewhere that points to economic inequality and the effects that it has on our society. And this is related to police fines and fees. So I'm going to use the jump-off point here by just saying, like, a good framing for this issue is the NPR Politics podcast did a story on this week, and there's a lot of other stories in the news, but that's kind of perhaps a useful way to jump off. So NPR Politics podcast, who pays for police? But anyways, it's been covered for a while that, especially after Ferguson, Missouri, and the unrest that happened there several years ago, where police departments have made more and more of their money since the 1980s through fines and fees. Indeed, city revenue overall, not just police, but particularly police, have had to rely on more revenue from other sources, such as fines and fees. This is why, for those who remember, in the 1980s, the Reagan administration and so on and so forth found it very vogue to cut taxes. This was happening in other countries around the world, like England, and our tax rates on the wealthiest in our society were drastically slashed. And ever since then, it has become political suicide to ask for tax increases, because we think that is anathema to American freedom and whatever else. Of course, I'm not shy in saying I think that point of view is absurd, and I think economic data supports it. We've been very lenient on the wealthiest in our society, and I'm not arguing to punish them. I'm just arguing for our governments to be funded with the amount of money they need to serve the people that they've created to serve. And we haven't done that for the past 40 years and beyond. And so beyond me getting frustrated, why does this matter? Because if police departments are more reliant on fines and fees to pay their own budgets and to pay their own staff, then what that becomes is it changes their relationship with people. If they need fines and fees, if they need to give out tickets, if they need to force court appearances, then we become their commodities. They then make money off of us. They then change the scope of their job to protect and serve, to fine and capitalize on. And that is the harmful effects of broken economic systems, is that it changes the fundamental relationships of human interaction, one between mutual cooperation to individual competition. and exploitation. And that is what happens, I think, so often in police departments around the country. I don't know if it happens in the RPD. The city budget just passed by city council this week, and you can look up the budget, and our fines and fees budget is pretty limited. I didn't do the simple division, but it seems to me to be pretty limited, but I'm sure there's journalists or investigative reporters out there who want to look into that. But anyways, this is really harmful because the notion of funding governments through fees and fines, especially police departments, creates predatory relationships. And we know that communities of color and communities of those who are low income are over-policed and stigmatized against as it is. So then you add on top of that a broken economic system that seeks to exploit people. It's really bad because it makes people more subject to wrongful violations of their civil rights. And I think this is why we have so much tension. This is in part why we have so much tension with police departments in this country. And it just fundamentally corrupts the notion of what police should exist for.
Yeah, I think you're right, Jason. I think this is such an illustrative example of the intersection of racism and poverty. Not only do you have a tax plan that benefits the wealthiest and typically whitest families in America, but the sort of response by many police departments is to increase the fines and policing that they do. And who is most likely to be targeted by police? It's black people and poor people. And the fundamental sort of injustice about this is two-pronged, is the sense that people are being targeted for their appearance, for their depictions in media, and also the fact that people who are being targeted often to support the system have the least amount to give, financially speaking. So it's just all around horrible.
Yeah, I want to add exactly, Matt. I want to add one more important point on top of that, and this is so interesting and so important to get down. So, okay, we cut taxes in the 1980s because we don't want to burden businesses and we don't want to burden the wealthy. And so what do our governments have to do? What do our police departments have to do? Instead of getting money through taxation from, for instance, people who already have too much discretionary income to begin with, they then have to come up with a fines and fees structure that essentially is a quasi-taxation system on our society's most marginalized people. And so instead of just taxing everyone equally, or everyone for their, not everyone equally, instead of taxing everyone for their fair share, we've essentially created a new extra taxation system on people of color, on low income people, through the system of fines and fees. And it's like this absurd example that's such a good example and such an absurd example of changing fee structures from those who perhaps should pay it to those who are most vulnerable. I'm seeing a call light up here, though, on Evidence of Design on 100.9 FM WXIR. Hello, you are on the air. What's on your mind?
Hi, this is Jeff from Webster, and I've been listening to your show the past hour.
Great. Thanks, Jeff. What's up?
And I just wanted to comment, the segment you're talking about now about police, fines, fees, etc., and you describe it as a predatory relationship. I'm saying this in a friendly way. I don't think you've really connected the dots correctly, because the fines and the fees are set by judges, not the police officers. The fines and the fees and surcharges are collected by the local governments and the county courts, and you don't know, you haven't set forth whether or not the fines and the fees go to pay for police budgets. You don't know where the money goes to. And I think the real point is the fines and the fees that are set against defendants in court, the poor and the economically disadvantaged, it has a huge impact on them. That's where I think the bad part of the fines and fees and surcharges are, that the ability to pay is much less for those at the lower part of the economic structure. but you really haven't said and you haven't proven that the fines and the fees are going to police forces. So I don't think your argument's connected.
Jeff, thanks for your call. I think we agree in principle when you're saying there that, you know, the danger is that folks who are low income or minority have the hardest chances to pay. And of course, if you don't pay one of your tickets, then it creates even more tickets, and you could get your licenses revoked and even more expenses. You can go to jail and all that sort of stuff. So keeping that in mind, yes. I would counter you by saying that we haven't established that the money is going to police departments. I'm not saying that police officers are themselves setting the fines and fee structures. Of course not. It's down to different municipalities and budget directors and mayors to come up with that system. And indeed, we know. Let's look at Rochester here. Where does the money go? Well, if we look up our budget in Rochester, the largest city department is the police department. 18% of the city's budget goes to the police. And there is a debate going on in the community right now with city council, and yes, particularly Councilmember Mary Lupian from the East District has called out Mayor Warren and the administration for saying that the city of Rochester spends more on the police when you add in their pensions than the city of Rochester does on libraries and youth services and education. And so you're right, I don't have the ability to say how each municipality across this country funds its government, but I do know that police departments tend to be expensive, and that here in Rochester, RPD is the largest budget. So I can't minutely trace the money, but we know that policing as it is established is quite expensive. And also this fines and fee structure is very expensive for the poorest in our community and those of color in our community. And you know who none of this is expensive for? Those who would have been paying taxes anyways to not even have to have this fine and fee structure to begin with. That's who it's not expensive for, is a tax write-off for the wealthiest. Matt, do you have anything to add on that?
I do. I just have one point. And like you said, Jason, while the police may not be setting the fines themselves, they do select who pays them, and we know who they're most likely to select.
You're saying in terms of who they pull over, who they give tickets to, who they police, essentially?
Right.
Yeah. I believe we do have to, normally our show would go a few more minutes, but I believe we have to end our shows a bit early here such that we can de-sanitize ourselves and go through the sanitation stations here. I'm just making all that up.
Oh, I've been touching the board with both of my hands, so I have to sanitize all of it.
Indeed. The COVID-19 is still very much out there, and so too is the other issues that we brought up today on Evidence of Design on 100.9 FM WXIR. Awkward way to fall off this cliff and an ending here, but I just looked at the time and I got spooked. So, thanks for tuning in to your local grassroots community radio station, and thanks for joining us and listening to us throughout the hour. At the beginning of the hour, Matt Treadwell gave an update on the election season that we are in right now. There's been early voting, there's absentee voting, and also on next Tuesday, June 23rd, is the Democratic presidential primary election day, and also the elections for state and local offices. So, don't miss that date, don't miss that day. Different ways to vote, and you can learn more at monroecounty.gov. And then we also, in the second half of the hour, talked about various economic indicators that continue to point to the harmful effects of increasing economic inequality. We looked at a new COVID-19 data set from the folks at Harvard's Opportunity Insights. You can learn more from them at tracktherecovery.org. And then we were just talking about a change in our system to necessitate more fines and fees to fund our municipal governments, because in the 1980s it became vogue to cut taxes on the wealthiest. And we're still kind of living through that regime today through harmful effects. So if you want to stay in touch with us and continue the conversation, you can do so at our email by emailing us at radioeod@gmail.com. You can also stay in touch with us on Twitter or Facebook at our Radio EOD handles. I was your host, Jason Taylor, and we were joined by our good friends and co-hosts, Matt Treadwell via phone.
Live from the comfort of my bedroom.
And Mary Lawrence.
Have a good day.
Intro and outro music, as always, is provided by Modest Mouse with the song "A Long Drive with Nothing to." That's wrong, Jason. Modest Mouse with the song "Dramamine" off of the album "A Long Drive with Nothing to Think About," and interstitial music by Modest Mouse. Tiny Cities Made of Ashes off of the album Moon and Antarctica. Stay tuned for coming up next. Jason is stuttering right now. The Esquire Hour, that's it. I haven't seen those folks in so long thanks to COVID. They do put on a good show, though, so stay tuned for the Esquire Hour. Thanks, take care, be well, be safe, and bye-bye.